This is where they used to do illegal garbage dumping. There was no fence. There were huge puddles, broken steel, old cars. It took us about a year to clear this place. A quote from sculptor Mark Di Suvero, quoted in a 1994 New York Times article. Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. I hope that everyone had a great week. I feel like I have a lot of stuff to talk about right here at the top of the show. But first, I wanted to give a quick overview of what I'm talking about today. So I'm continuing my look at hidden cemeteries in Queens, or I guess I should say hidden cemeteries in Western Queens, but mostly Astoria, because there's so many around here. And this week, we're going to look at a park in the area on the water here in Astoria that has a stone wall around it that's partially made of tombstones. It's so weird. I'm there all the time, like I'm there at least several times a week. I see people walking by it all the time. People don't seem to notice their very obvious tombstones right there in the wall. So I want to look at the history of the park and some theories about where these tombstones may have come from. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But before we get to that, I thought it was worth mentioning that I visited the cemeteries I talked about last week. I actually visited them twice this week, once at night. I got a lot of cool nighttime pictures of the cemeteries, and it was nice walking around Old Astoria in the evening, and then once during the day on Saturday. One thing that I did notice that I wanted to mention is, you know how I was like talking about St. George's Cemetery, and I was talking about how there was part of the wall missing or part of the fence missing on one side. Well, that fence has since been replaced. Since January, they've replaced it. And that's great in terms of maintaining the cemetery. Like to see a nicely maintained cemetery. Though it means it's a lot harder to take pictures of it from that kind of hidden side view. And also one thing that is kind of funny. So on Saturday, when I was walking around to the cemeteries, I was talking to my sister on the phone. And as we were talking, I was like, okay, now I'm at Socrates Sculpture Park. Okay, now I'm at St. George's Cemetery. Okay, now I'm at the Irish Famine Cemetery. Now I'm at the Church of the Redeemer, etc. I was just like walking around. And it's kind of wild how close together all these things are. They're close enough to each other that you can be on a phone call and kind of just pass them by and point them out. Just because sometimes, especially if you don't live in a neighborhood, it can be hard to quantify or imagine how far or close things are from each other. And I can definitely say that the stuff I talked about last week and the park I'm talking about today are all very close together, which makes sense, right? Because it's the old families in the area having all their stuff near each other. So another thing I wanted to mention here at the top is that an essay that I wrote about the ghosts of the Hell Gate has been published in a new journal highlighting the work of women in the paranormal. I am super excited to be included in this really cool project, and I'm extremely excited to read everybody else's essays. I saw the table of contents, and it looks like some really cool stuff, so excited for my copies to come in. But if you are curious and want to pick up a copy of that, you can find it on Amazon. The journal is called The Feminine Macabre. I had a little bit of trouble searching it on Amazon, so you can also go to spookeats.com/feminine macabre, and that has a link to where you can purchase it on Amazon. This project was put together by Amanda Woomer, who runs the website Spook Eats, and who's also an author. She wrote A Haunted Atlas of Western New York and some other cool books. And I think this is just such a cool project that she put together. And like I said, super happy to be a part of it. So I feel like I've been talking a lot and I'm not even at today's topic, so I'll save my book report segment for next week. And let's dive into a look at the mysterious, unexplained tombstones at Socrates Sculpture Park. I was originally going to talk about 1.5 cemeteries today, but as often happens with me, I have a tendency to go down a wormhole, and my notes for this episode became 2 episodes worth. So today, let's talk about that half cemetery. which is what I'm considering Socrates Sculpture Park, with all of its tombstones and stuff. So, like I said, there's a beautiful park on the water here in Astoria called Socrates Sculpture Park. It is at Hallett's Cove, and it's right across the river from the lighthouse at Roosevelt Island. So it's right in that small area of New York City that I'm really into and really fascinated by. Before it was a park, it was an illegal dumping ground, and then before that, there was a creek at that location called the Sunswick Creek, and that was later filled in, and that is a whole story for another day. There was a lot of drama about that creek, but of course, most people don't even know it exists. I think there's a bar named after it, so most people probably just know the bar in Astoria, not the actual creek. And, I've mentioned this park before, both here on the show and on Instagram. It's one of my very favorite places in New York City. It's not really near the subway. I think it's around a mile away from the subway. And, it's in Queens, which is a place where people from other boroughs and people from other parts of the country and the world don't tend to venture unless they're visiting someone here. But it's a real hidden gem. It has a fascinating history. And, it's this unbelievably beautiful waterfront park that is also an open-air art museum. It always has really cool sculptures on display. So just as an example, right now, there's one sculpture that is a bunch of U.S. Postal Service boxes filled with aluminum ingots that are melted down from aluminum cans. And as it's gotten worn down by rain and the elements, the boxes have been kind of stripped away bit by bit. And because I'm at that park pretty often, I've gotten to watch it kind of dissolve and change, which is really cool. That one's by Andrea Solstad. There's one really cool sculpture there that is made out of wax, and it has candle wicks in it. And it's a flag that's black and white that is sort of reminiscent of, but it's not actually an American flag. But the cool thing about this sculpture is that it encourages people to interact with the sculpture in the form of lighting the candle wicks and melting away parts of the statue or parts of the sculpture. So it's been really cool to watch that sculpture melt before your eyes at this park week by week. And you can go to the Socrates Sculpture Park Instagram for some really cool videos of it actually being on fire. So that piece is by Sandy Williams IV. There's a really cool piece by a sculptor named Jeffrey Gibson that is this huge 3-tiered pyramid that is lit up at night, which is kind of funny because the park is closed after dark. It's only open till dusk, but you can see it through the fence of the park. So a lot of the times at night, I look at it through the fence. And the concept behind it is really cool. I'm just going to read a little bit from the exhibit information. So this is by Jeffrey Gibson. Gibson designed the multi-tiered structure to reference the earthen architecture of the ancient metropolis of Cahokia, which was the largest city of the North American indigenous Mississippian people at its height in the 13th century. The earth mound of the pre-Columbian ziggurat is represented in Gibson's multi-tiered monument with a plywood structure adorned with a vibrant surface of wheat-pasted posters. Gibson also curated a series of indigenous-led performances to activate the structure over the course of the Monuments Now exhibition. And that's another thing you can check out Socrates Sculpture Park's Instagram for different performances that have been held on the different tiers of the pyramid. It's a really cool park. The art's always really interesting, aesthetically pleasing, tied to history, fun to interact with, and just really cool. There's something about Socrates Sculpture Park that feels a little less polished and a little more focused on community than a lot of parks are in the city. They have all sorts of events. They have a job creation program that's tied in to the park's mission in a really cool way. But despite the park's popularity in this part of Queens, if it's a beautiful day, there'll just be tons and tons of people there from the neighborhood. Despite its popularity, no one seems to be talking about these tombstones or grave markers in the stone wall around the park. As far as I can tell, it's just me and one local guy online. And I'll talk about both my theories and his theories later. But, I've written to the park asking if they know what's going on with the stones. Where did they come from? How long have they been there? Haven't heard back. I wrote to them maybe a year ago, almost a year ago. And I've read that supposedly the park's employees don't know what's up with the tombstones. No one really seems to have an answer. But in looking for the answer, I started digging into the park's history, which is really interesting. It's very Queens. And while I don't have a definitive answer now, I'm going to keep digging into this, and I think the answer is somewhere in the park's history. I'm determined to find it. So let's get into this area. I talk about this part of New York City very often, and the Queens waterfront is really important to the community here. So for example, my city council representative, Costa Constantinides, has been doing a lot of work to try to improve the waterfront, including this part of the waterfront. So 3 of New York City's largest housing projects are within about a mile of Socrates Sculpture Park. So that's a lot of people who stand to have their quality of life improved if the waterfront is improved, whether it's reducing pollution from power plants, which I'll talk about some more next week, or cleaning up the ruins of abandoned industrial projects. So for example, in October 2020, he worked to get funding to read from an article in Queens.com, finally remove debris and trash, restore the riverbank's ecology, and take down a decaying pier known as the Radio Tower, built almost 70 years ago but long closed to the public due to its rotting condition. The Radio Tower embodies how physically and emotionally cut off Western Queens residents are from their side of the East River. I just want to pause here real quick. This is outside of the scope of this episode, but I do know there's a little bit of complexity anytime you're talking about improving a neighborhood of New York City, right? I support the waterfront beautification projects because, for example, the Radio Tower is right next to the Astoria houses. I really do think that improving the waterfront will improve people's quality of life. And also, selfishly, I spent a lot of time on that part of the waterfront. But it is true that developers have been buying up parts of Astoria, especially the parts by the water, and building these hideous, awful, extremely expensive condo buildings and apartment buildings. And obviously gentrification is not good. It makes everyone's rent prices go up, but especially people who've been in the neighborhood a long time. So I know it's complicated when you talk about making any part of New York City nicer, especially when it's near so much luxury housing. I mean, these are apartments that are unbelievably expensive. For example, Hallett's Point, which is one of these big fancy buildings, has 1 bedrooms that cost $2,300, which is almost $1,000 more than what a 1 bedroom costs in this neighborhood right now. So I've mentioned this before, but developers in New York City are not good. Nobody wants $2,300 1 bedroom apartments. And nobody wants these horrible buildings being built everywhere. It doesn't help anybody. But to get back to this idea of cleaning up the Queens waterfront, you might think, oh, what is there really to clean up? Why is this such a big project? One of the things you have to understand about Queens is that every place that can be an illegal dump will become an illegal dumping ground for industrial garbage, for household garbage, for businesses garbage, etc. For example, when I lived in Woodside, I lived right next to the train tracks, which were up on a sort of viaduct that connected to the Hellgate Bridge. So that meant that I had to cross under one of the 3 arches that are under the elevated railroad tracks to get to the subway every day. And 2 of those 3 arches on any given day beneath them would just be full of garbage. And that would include everything from cast-off mattresses and strollers to huge bags of trash and car parts. And there were a lot of junked out cars just all around the area. There was actually a car junkyard right on my street. For whatever reason, Queens is full of junk. And I find it kind of delightful and weird. Like, there are just certain parts of this area that if you know to walk by, you just know you'll find a bunch of cars with no windows that are missing an enormous amount of the car and other things like that. But dumping grounds are a big part of Queens. It's actually a big part of this story, even though it sounds like a non sequitur. And it's important to this story because the area that Socrates Sculpture Park was built on, like I mentioned, was an illegal dumping ground. So I did a lot of digging through some New York State newspapers, archives, and I found a bunch of condescending articles from the 80s and 90s about the park, kind of looking down their noses at the idea of art in Queens. Can you imagine? And they didn't answer the mystery I'm trying to solve here, though there are a few clues. But before I get to those articles from the 80s and 90s, I want to start with a great 2016 article from urbanomnibus.net that talks about the park's history. And I'm interested in the history because I'm looking for any information about the construction of the park, in particular its walls, and anything else that they found when cleaning up the site to make it a park. So let's get into this article. When Di Severo, other artists, and nearby residents launched the Socrates project atop a former marine terminal in Hallett's Cove, the neighborhood was quite different. Di Severo recently described the Astoria of the 80s to the Times. There was a popular carjacking spot just up the road, and Di Severo was mugged by one of the park's own maintenance employees at the door of his studio down the street. Like many city neighborhoods targeted by artists priced out of Manhattan, this part of Astoria was far poorer and less safe than today, nor did it immediately gentrify with the onset of artistic activity. Occupying the former marshland around the mouth of the tidal Sunswick Creek, which had been progressively filled beginning in the late 19th century, the terminal was still receiving barges in the early 1950s. Like many vacant waterfront sites across the city during the 1970s and 1980s, the future park was used for illegal dumping and other surreptitious activity. It was just the kind of site that appealed to Di Severo. The former Chicago steelworker moved into a studio in a former waterfront brick handling shed just down the street in 1980, and was eyeing the open-air space to construct and display large-scale metal sculptures, some of which required the use of a construction crane. Working with the Athena Foundation, which he founded 9 years earlier to support artistic endeavor in the city, Di Severo raised $200,000 for the park's construction and negotiated a 5-year lease on the property with its owner, the Departments of Ports and Terminals, for $1 a year. Straddling Broadway and extending north and south along Vernon Boulevard, this section of Astoria was far from New York's downtown art scene and nearly a mile from the nearest subway station. By the 1980s, the area was a jumble of dilapidated piers, old factory buildings, warehouses, storage sheds, auto repair shops, and 2- and 3-story residential walk-ups, anchored by 2 public housing projects. One of the area's largest industrial employers, the Somer & Company Piano Factory, was shuttered in 1982. The 96-year-old building was converted to residential condominiums beginning in 2007. Yet with Di Severo's studio at the north and Isamu Noguchi's studio, now the site of the Noguchi Museum, just to the south, Socrates was poised to become the center of a small but growing arts community. Di Severo enlisted dozens of neighborhood volunteers and their children to contribute to his broad vision of local engagement. Throughout 1986, the team of artists and residents used their own sweat equity to remake the barren, debris-strewn site into a welcoming, if still raw, 4-acre park with winding gravel paths and beds of wildflowers built around the installations of the inaugural exhibition. Concrete piers and seawalls were still exposed throughout the landfill. Artworks were placed on top of them. So I thought that was a really interesting background about the park. I hadn't read anywhere else really that this had been a marine terminal, and when I found this article I started Googling other things, and I'm trying to find out more information about this marine terminal. I found a little bit, but I think I can do better. I think I can find more in the future. But one thing that I thought was really potentially maybe a clue is the fact that the building that Di Severo bought to use as his studio, which is still standing, it is in between that radio tower ruin thing and Hallett's Cove, where the sculpture park is. That large shed sort of area used to be a brick handling shed. So probably stonework wasn't done there, right? Not totally sure what brick handling means, but I assume that means they were making bricks. Kind of like how further down the coastline there was the New York Terracotta, I think it's called the New York Architectural Terracotta Company, that still has a really beautiful building just south of the Queensboro Bridge. That was definitely a big sort of thing around here, but part of me wonders, I wonder if the brick shed also did any stonework? Might they have carved some tombstones that didn't end up being used and had been left in a corner, and Di Suvero thought he could repurpose them? Maybe. Who knows? It is an idea, though. Also, this is an aside, but I walk by his studio pretty often, and it is this huge shed factory thing. But in my head, I call it the Hall of the Rat King because, and skip ahead if you have a phobia of rats, just skip ahead right now. A couple months ago, I was walking by, as I often do, and saw on the side of the beach by the shed more rats than I've ever seen in my entire life. There was one big rock that had probably 30 just on that one rock. There were probably at least 100. They were swarming. It was the most terrifying and horrific thing I've ever seen when it comes to rodents. So I don't know if they're usually inside and I just happened to see them on the beach that day. I just don't look at that part of the beach anymore. I just look at the middle of the beach where all the birds hang out. I just look away from the Hall of the Rat King. So, with that horrifying anecdote out of the way, let's look at some articles from 1986 when Di Suvero was cleaning up the area with the help of local folks. So, the New York Times on October 12, 1986, wrote this about the location of the park. The site is impressive. It is on the East River, facing the northern tip of Roosevelt Island, just south of Hellgate, the point of intersection between the Harlem and East Rivers, where treacherous currents decide periodically to wrestle unsuspecting boats to their death. The site was formerly the home of a marine terminal. The slip was filled in about 15 years ago, but some of the concrete pedestals used for the moorings remain, and they are now bases for sculpture. Whatever happens on this plot of land will be engaged by the Manhattan skyline and the East River, which are so much a part of American myth. Di Suvero had his eye on what was then 4 acres of garbage and rubble since 1980, when he took over a former brick handling facility down the road and began transforming it into a waterside studio. The park is still raw, and there is no sense yet of a clear guiding vision, but its very existence is remarkable, and its potential is almost unlimited. When the lease runs out, the city is considering the possibility of turning 2 acres of the park into luxury housing, Di Suvero said. We would like to see all 4 acres remain a sculpture park indefinitely. I found a follow-up article from May 26, 1994 in the New York Times, from when the sculpture park was officially made a park, rather than just a short-term lease from the city. One man's dream to clean up a garbage dump and build a park, a sculpture garden, beside the East River with the jagged skyline of Manhattan a distant backdrop, officially became a reality yesterday. It was formally dedicated as a city park, the first major addition to the park system in more than a decade. So as you can see from those last couple articles, the fight against developers wanting to build tons of luxury housing everywhere and ruining the city for everyone else is not a new one. It wasn't new in 1994, and it's definitely not new now. So I found another New York Times article from August 11th, 1997. In the 1980s, the area was a prime site of illegal dumping. There was no fence, and broken steel and abandoned cars defined the landscape. Mr. Di Suvero and Mr. Noguchi looked at the garbage and envisioned a protected park that could provide an ongoing experimental narrative in the medium of sculpture. Mr. Di Suvero and others continued to push for more permanent protection for the park because developers for years had hungered to build luxury housing there, but had been defeated by real estate recessions, lack of local amenities, distant transportation, and other problems. So like I said, developers have continued to buy up land all around the park and the Queens waterfront in general, and they have built hideous new construction that costs way more than anything should cost in Astoria. And that's a battle that I guess is never going to end. Just yesterday I was reading an article about this awful housing development just a few miles south in Long Island City that is on the location of what used to be this really amazing art space. It was called 5 Points, and it was a graffiti showcase, I guess you could call it. It was really like an open-air museum with these beautiful, beautiful murals, really cool street art. It was right across the street from PS1, which is an outpost of MoMA, or the Museum of Modern Art. But to make a long story short, developers decided it would be a great location for a really hideous set of residential towers for rich people. So that's what it is now. It's been under construction for a while, and instead of being studio space for artists and gallery space for artists, now it's these awful, awful towers that have, quote, affordable housing in them. New York City has this rule where new construction, I think projects of a certain size, have to have what they call affordable housing. And let me tell you, this housing is not affordable. So for example, in this apartment complex, they have affordable studio apartments renting for $1,850 a month. One-bedroom apartments rent for $2,295 a month, and two-bedroom apartments go for $2,775 a month, which those amounts are mind-blowing to me, especially because those are the affordable housing. $1,800, more than $1,800 for a studio, I mean, that's more than what we used to pay for a one-bedroom, not in affordable housing, just in regular housing in Astoria. These developers stand to make so much money, and they'll destroy any kind of public art institution that they can if they can make a buck. It's just awful. But let's get back to the whole reason why I'm talking about the sculpture park. So, like I mentioned, I've been trying to figure out what the deal is with this wall of tombstones for about a year. Like, I've been aware of them for a while. I've been pretty unsuccessful at finding answers. And to kind of describe what we're looking at here, the wall goes around maybe half or a third of the park. It's the part of the wall that faces the public. So the part, when the park is closed, you can still see the stone wall with the cemetery markers, grave markers. There are some of those old Victorian tree trunk looking grave markers. There's a lot of the markers that look kind of like blocks with a letter on them. There are a couple that have the beginning of someone's name. There's one that just says STE. And there's one that, I don't know why I didn't write this down. I think it says Gorges, Gorges. And that's the only full name on one of the tombstones. So this is such a popular park in the area. So many people who are observant and love art and history come to see the sculptures. I don't know why more people aren't troubled by this mystery, but as far as I can tell from the internet, there are only two people who care about this. Me and someone named Mark Thomas, who has a YouTube channel and a blog. He made a couple YouTube videos about this very topic. I watched them yesterday. One of them has 7 views, one of them has 1 view, which again makes me ask, why aren't people more fascinated by this? They were some of the first things that came up when I Googled this mystery. Why is nobody talking about the tombstones? I know I probably seem a little intense right now, but that's what happens when you've been thinking about something for a year and don't have much of an answer. However, our friend Mark Thomas, who really I should write to, has a lot more information than I was able to glean. He said that he spoke to a local historian or person who was looped in on history, and here's the story he was told. In the 1970s or 1980s, St. Michael's Cemetery, which is a nearby cemetery, if you follow the show on Instagram, you've seen tons of pictures of it. St. Michael's Cemetery was in disrepair, it was overgrown, it didn't even really look like a cemetery anymore, it was a wreck. So new management came in, and they cleaned it up, and they got rid of a bunch of tombstones that had not had perpetual care paid for as part of the package, so they were within their rights to get rid of their tombstones and cover their graves, and the idea was that they were going to put 6 feet of dirt on top of these tombstones so they could keep burying people there. And I think the story goes that they were found out and they weren't actually able to bury anyone on that hill, but they had already moved the tombstones and covered up the graves. And that's potentially what this large empty hill in St. Michael's Cemetery is. I can say there is a lot of space in St. Michael's Cemetery, and I know the exact hill he's talking about. It seems sort of possible, but even he doesn't think that story is right, and he has good reason to say so. So he says that the tombstones can't be from St. Michael's, because St. Michael's has plots, and there is writing on some of these tombstones. Some of them are kind of taller, skinnier stones that say lot on them. Not plot, but lot. And a lot of them have numbers, usually in the 2000s. So you do see a little bit of the naming convention on these stones that are in the wall. So if they're not from St. Michael's, where could they be from? Mark Thomas says that his guess is that the tombstones may be from Mount Zion Cemetery, but he doesn't really elaborate on why. I know there's work to be done to potentially compare the numbering systems to all the different numbering systems of all the different cemeteries in Queens and see what has lots, etc. And I know that Mark Thomas has said that he wants to find out whose tombstones these are and then put up a plaque so that these people aren't forgotten. And I think that's a really, really great idea, assuming these tombstones were real grave markers. Now, my theory that I had up until November when Mark Thomas posted this video and some accompanying blog posts, my theory had always been that these tombstones were never used as tombstones. And I had always imagined that maybe, there's a lot of industry in the area. There's a lot of cemeteries in the area. That means there must be a lot of tombstone makers in the area. So I always assumed that there were some extra tombstones lying around at some tombstone maker's place. Maybe they hadn't been paid for or picked up or whatever. And I always imagined that this proprietor of the tombstone store, you know what I mean, stonemason or whatever, donated them to be part of the wall of Socrates Sculpture Park. I have no evidence to support that claim. It's just a theory. Another theory that I have is maybe someone wanted to get rid of some tombstones that they weren't able to sell, or, maybe there was an order that ended up being canceled or something, and so they dumped them in the illegal dumping ground, and then when they were cleaning up the site, they found them and were like, great, let's use them as part of the wall. Seems possible. I also mentioned earlier my theory that maybe these stones were in the old factory building that Mark de Severo bought. Seems possible. Just this morning, I found a 30th anniversary book called Socrates Sculpture Park 30 Years that had a little bit more information about what sort of stuff the former marine terminal was used for, and this information could maybe, possibly support my theory. Let me read from that. Formerly a port for offloading stone and sand, this neglected plot of landfill accumulated what the shipping terminal left behind, whether construction debris or collapsed piers. What stood out to me about this sentence is, formerly a port for offloading stone and sand. What kind of stone? Was it rough stone to be used in building buildings? Was it stone that was already carved? Perhaps tombstones that were already carved? I don't know. Just something about it, like knowing that it had been a port for offloading stone, and the sentence, this neglected plot of landfill accumulated what the shipping terminal left behind, makes me wonder if there could be something to back up my theory that I totally made up out of whole cloth. Maybe. There's also another possibility, which is that they could be from a cemetery that doesn't exist anymore. Last week I talked a little bit about cemeteries that have been gotten rid of in the area, mostly to make way for power plants, and next week I'm going to talk a lot more about that. There are a surprising number of cemeteries in this area that were obliterated to build power plants. It's kind of weird, but I think it is totally possible that maybe they're from a cemetery that doesn't exist anymore. The only thing that makes me pause and doubt that idea that it could be from an old, smaller cemetery is some of those markers do have numbers in the 2000s, which does seem to me to indicate that they're probably from a larger cemetery, because a small family cemetery or a small church cemetery wouldn't have that many people. I guess one other theory that I hadn't really thought about is there did used to be some larger cemeteries in Manhattan. I don't think they were huge, but they were probably larger than the family cemeteries in Queens. There were some larger cemeteries in Manhattan, like the one I mentioned when I talked about St. Mark's Church, I guess earlier this year. The one that had existed a couple blocks away that was destroyed so they could build some buildings on top of it. There were potentially larger cemeteries like that, if a developer's getting rid of the cemetery, you move the bodies to another cemetery, but what do you do with the tombstones and markers? If they don't match the nomenclature of the new cemetery, if the lot numbers are different or whatever, you wouldn't really have a way to use them. And a lot of the stones that are in Socrates Sculpture Park's wall are those just square markers, things that maybe could have been lost in a shuffle. I don't know, maybe they were the remains of a larger, forgotten cemetery in the city that just got relocated and dumped in Queens because Queens is where people like to dump things. Seems possible. While I'm making things up, seems likely enough. So like I said, I wrote to the park almost a year ago and didn't hear back. I'm not surprised, not just because it's a pandemic, but also because I'm sure they have better things to do than field questions from local busybodies. But while I've talked for quite a while about this park and its history and its mysteries, I of course don't have an answer yet, but I'm going to continue researching this. I would love to hear any theories anybody has about this, any intel anyone has, any leads that people think I could maybe try to follow that I haven't thought of yet. Searched a lot of old newspaper databases for things like Sunswick Creek, the creek that used to be in this location. I've looked for the Socrates Sculpture Park. I could probably search Hallett's Cove, see if I can find anything there. But I will welcome any intel or any suggestions that anyone has on trying to find out what's going on with this. Like I said, half of a hidden cemetery. It's not really a cemetery, maybe, but it is hidden. It's a mystery. And you could definitely say that it's a buried secret, for sure. So thanks so much for listening. You can follow the show on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. If you liked this show, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on your podcatcher of choice. You can write to me at buriedsecretspodcast@gmail.com. And of course, as always, the show notes for this episode will be at buriedsecretspodcast.com. Thanks so much for listening.